Hey, I'm Ryan Reynolds.
Recently, I asked Mint Mobile's legal team if big wireless companies are allowed to raise prices due to inflation. They said yes. And then when I asked if raising prices technically violates those onerous two-year contracts, they said, "What the f*** are you talking about, you insane Hollywood ass?" So to recap, we're cutting the price of Mint Unlimited from $30 a month to just $15 a month.
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
Morning, everybody. Corey used bloody history. So, today we're going to continue on with Tripping Down Memory Lane, which is a book by Buddy Simcoe. His obituary and his other documents have different names, of course. Roland Allen Buddy, in quotes, Simcoe. That's the final name of this man. Roland Allen Buddy Simcoe. Remember, Simcoe is not even his birth name, which we don't know. We'll never know, because he changed it to his adoptive father, his name. But this guy was seemingly glued at the hip with Kerry Thornley throughout the Marines and after. So let's see what old Mr. Buddy Simcoe has to say about Kerry Thornley. To whom it may concern. This is a memorandum recounting my knowledge of Kerry Thornley's association with Lee Harvey Oswald. It was begun at the suggestion of Greg Hill, who has known Kerry Thornley since high school in Whittier, California, during the mid-1950s. In 1968, Greg Hill and I met and discussed what we knew of Thornley's involvement with Oswald. Then they were both stationed at the same military base in California in '59. We also discussed Thornley's subsequent literary activities while he was residing in New Orleans from 1961 to 1964. New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison's indictment of Kerry Thornley for perjury, precipitated by Thornley's denial that he had met with Oswald in New Orleans in 1963. The indictment was later dismissed, provided the impetus for the original meeting and my subsequent memorandum to Greg Hill in 1968 and this updated account. Years later, Thornley said that while he was residing in New Orleans in mid-1963, he unknowingly associated with at least one of the architects of President Kennedy's assassination. He recalls, sorry if I'm going to chuckle periodically through this. He recalls having had discussions with someone introduced as Gary Kirsten. Thornley reported later concluded Kirsten was actually E. Howard Hunt, and how they speculated as to how a president could be assassinated. During the course of their speculations, reference was made to framing a jailbird. These specific words used in another context are what triggered Thornley's recollection of the significance of these mid-1963 conversations. I'm not sure if the context of the conversations was associated with Thornley's writing of fiction, but I suspect that it was. He was drawn to discussions with various colorful individuals to gather material for his yet-to-be-written novels about New Orleans. In later years, I discovered that Oswald had enlisted 6 weeks earlier in October of 1956. We went through the same training series at the same bases. He was a month ahead of me in training schedule, and I didn't meet him until over 2 years after our enlistment, when we were both at the same air base in California. First there was boot camp, 15 weeks at the Marine Corps Recruit Depot in San Diego, California, followed by advanced combat training at Camp Pendleton. All right, let me pause right here real quick. I've read this many times, this 15 weeks for basic training and then followed by advanced combat training. Oswald didn't have that much fucking time. If he entered in October of 56, how could he do all that stuff and be out by January the 18th? He couldn't. We have some time missing here, right? So it appears as though Oswald might have entered into the Marines earlier than we suspect. These were the same duty stations and schools as Oswald's, except he was always over a month ahead of me in training. We both were assigned an MOS, that's a military occupation specialty job title, of 6741, or Aviation Electronics Radar Operator. The duties of a radar operator were not complicated, but the job was classified as critical because we worked with classified equipment and operational codes. Accordingly, we were given confidential security clearances. We monitored radar scopes, updating plotting boards. Okay, I'm sorry, let me pause right here. Plotting boards. The plotting boards is the closest I can get Oswald to a radar unit. I haven't seen one person state that he ever sat behind a radar unit machine. And I actually have in Jack Swike's book, he straight up says that Oswald was a plotting board operator, not a radar operator. So he must have not been able to find anything either. We monitored radar scopes, updated plotting boards, communicated with a ground control approach squadron, and with air traffic when logging them out or passing off control to ground control approach for landing instructions. Our primary mission involved the direction of fighter aircraft to targets as directed by the radar control officers, MOS 6709. Much of our time was spent in mock air combat training exercises, both in real time and with electronic simulation devices. As radar operators, we were not trained technicians, positions which required over 1 year of additional schooling at the Naval Air Station in Memphis, Tennessee. Our post-boot camp and post-combat training classes in radar operations had been of a few weeks' duration. I never understood why my related civilian occupation was listed on my separation papers as radio repairman, a totally unrelated activity. This was either a clerical error or a mistake at the higher level. Either way, I was disappointed in the shoddy attention to detail at the time of my separation from active military duty. We were all given confidential security clearances upon graduation from Radar Operations School at the Marine Detachment Center, Keesler Air Force Base in Biloxi, Mississippi, and then assigned to our first non-training duty stations. Some were assigned for duty in Japan, others to Cherry Point, North Carolina, and the remainder to Santa Ana, California. Oswald was sent to MACS-1 at Atsugi Naval Air Station in Japan. MACS denotes Marine Air Control Squadron. I, some 6 weeks later, was ordered to report for duty with MACS-9 near El Toro Marine Air Station in California near Santa Ana. MCAF, the Marine Corps Air Facility, a subsidiary of El Toro. I arrived in August of 1957 and remained until late May of 1959, not quite 2 years, until transferred for an overseas tour of duty with the 1st Marine Air Wing in Japan. In August of 1957, I settled into life at MACS-9, but not as a full-time radar operator. Sergeant Major Lusk, the senior non-commissioned officer, needed a replacement for one of the clerks who was about to be discharged, a Corporal Meeks. Curiously, Meeks disappeared just 4 weeks before he was to be discharged at the end of his 3-year enlistment. He was listed as absent without leave. We never heard from him again. Sergeant Major Lusk learned of my typing skills, as noted in my personnel file. Consequently, I spent most of the next 3 years working as an administrative clerk, although initially I did stand occasional radar watches to maintain my proficiency as a radar operator. I was not pleased at being assigned the duties of an office pinky. We referred to ourselves as Remington Raiders. I expressed my disappointment. Sergeant Major Lusk explained that I was at the top. He said there was no place for me to go except down. Although it took some time, I later came to appreciate that the Sergeant Major's observations were accurate. A few weeks following the new assignment, my confidential security clearance was upgraded to secret, and I assumed the duties of a secret and confidential file clerk. This was a routine job of retrieving, routing, and filing classified files, nothing above classification of secret. Top secret files were located at an unrelated site. MACS-9 was a radar squadron located in an isolated area apart from the main side base groupings of other squadrons. Our living quarters were located near the working compound. We did not reside in ordinary barracks, as did most of the other Marines at El Toro. Our quarters were old Quonset huts, formerly occupied by married enlisted men and their families during World War II. Each hut was partitioned into 2 halves, with 3 rooms in each half. Enlisted personnel were assigned to 2 to a room. We frequently joked about the decrepit appearance of the huts, tin shacks with peeling paint, but in fact most of us preferred our quarters to the more impersonal standard of squad bays, barracks, and lack of privacy, the usual fare for enlisted personnel. We became acquainted with just about everyone in the squadron because of our unique living and working conditions, and the fact that we were located apart from other squadrons. There were fewer than 200 enlisted men in MACS 9. In June of 1958, I married and commenced residing off base in Orange, California, in an apartment building occupied by other married enlisted men from MACS 9. Thereafter, except for monthly 24-hour duty assignments, I associated with my fellow Marines at MACS 9 only during working hours. During my 2 years in MACS 9, there was a general turnover in personnel. Some were assigned to duty stations overseas or were discharged at fairly regular intervals. Others returning from overseas tours of duties checked into the squadron. There was a particularly large influx of radar operators in the spring of 1959. One of them was Lee Oswald. Kerry Thornley also transferred to MACS 9 at about the same time, approximately March of 1959. Although he was not returning from Japan, he was a radar operator who was a reservist who had been on active duty for only a few weeks, having been trained while in the reserves. I believe he was a student at USC at the time he was in the reserves. There was generally a casual atmosphere in the squadron to begin with. Since there were so many lieutenants in the squadron, radar control officers, the regulation requiring enlisted men to salute officers was suspended around the working compound. With the influx of personnel returning from Japan, this relaxed atmosphere was reinforced. The new guys were salty as compared to the rest of us. Most of us had only a few weeks or months remaining before leaving the service, and they all had tales from Japan and about how different military life was there as compared to stateside, as I later confirmed. Oswald was one of the few in the squadron with the military rank of private. Anyone with over 2 or 3 years of service was a corporal. I didn't think much about this, figuring there were plenty of opportunities to get into trouble while in Japan, usually related to drinking, and being reduced in rank was the usual punishment. Oswald was a nondescript person who was generally sloppy in appearance. He wore his hat pulled down over his eyes, Beetle Bailey style, and his shirt was usually loose and his boots scuffed. He seemed almost to cultivate his unkempt appearance. Consequently, anytime a work detail was formed, he was usually the first to be selected. He would take everything in stride with a cocky, so what attitude, and I never observed him becoming upset by anything. It was common knowledge that Oswald was studying the Russian language. He appeared to be fairly advanced in conversational Russian at the time he reported to MACS 9. Obviously, he'd begun his studies while in Japan. He displayed a sense of humor that he frequently made jokes while in ranks while waiting for a formation to be called to attention. He would affect a thick Russian accent in English and make comments such as, "The collectivist labor meeting is about to begin," for example. He would often utter phrases in Russian. One summer afternoon, I was taking a break in the recreation hut with Corporal Rocky Camarada and a few others. All right, hang on a second. Note to self, Camarada is at MACS 9, okay? Because I was having trouble placing it. Rocky had his tape recorder and was taping an improvised comedy routine. Oswald walked in and asked if he could say a few words into the recorder. Rocky gave him the microphone, and Oswald spoke in Russian for a few minutes, gesticulating as if addressing a large crowd. He played the recording back and seemed pleased at his proficiency with the language, but of course the rest of us did not understand what he had said. At this time, I didn't know Kerry Thornley well. We became better acquainted when we both received our orders for duty in Japan a few weeks later. Nor did I know Oswald well. I can only recall conversing with him on one occasion when I was taking a break from one of my infrequent radar watches. He was walking by and stopped to talk for a few minutes. It was late afternoon, and I was looking in the direction of a farmhouse located a few hundred yards beyond the fence. He told me the Russian word for farmhouse, just in case you should ever have to know. This was said in a light-hearted manner, trying to initiate a conversation. I was not particularly responsive. Oswald continued on his way, and I returned to my radar watch in operations. It was unusual that Oswald seemed so preoccupied with his study of all things Russian, at least in comparison with the majority of the other enlisted men. Most didn't appear to take Oswald seriously in terms of being a security threat. In general terms, most of us didn't really take anything that seriously. Oswald himself was probably more sober than any of us. In terms of his interests, he never commented on parties, girls, cars, the standard topics of conversation throughout the ranks. It was obvious he was intent on mastering the Russian language, and I frequently observed him studying and practicing pronouncing Russian words. I heard of one incident when Lieutenant Vincent DePadro questioned Oswald's Russian interests. Lieutenant DePadro, MOS 6709, radar control officer from Florida, who happened to be in the mailroom one day and saw a Russian publication addressed to Private Oswald. I believe it was printed in Russian. The lieutenant began inquiring as to why anyone would subscribe to a Russian newspaper written in Russian. When I heard of this from others while in the recreation hut, those present laughed because someone said it was just Oswald. Kerry Thornley and Oswald were soon debating and discussing one thing or another. I recall passing through the recreation hut one day. There were others that had assembled in a standby situation when someone mentioned to Oswald that Kerry was an agnostic. Oswald said to Kerry, "I think communism is the best religion." I went on my way as the two of them pursued this point. I believe this was the first time they spoke to each other. Kerry soon had a reputation of being quick to debate anyone on any subject. Sometimes he was quite assertive in his views. At the time, he admired Castro, and at one time, I believe, he wore 2 wristwatches, one set to Greenwich Mean Time, as Castro did. He always seemed to have a book tucked under his arm and was fond of quoting Robert Ingersoll. Helping hands help by far more than lips that pray. At the end of the day, I returned to my residence off base. I never saw Oswald after working hours, and have no idea how he spent his time when not on duty. Despite his interest in the Russian language and comments about communism, unusual for a private in the Marines, he stood his regular radar watches. As previously noted, he was not regarded as a security threat. Otherwise, he would not have been allowed to work in a position requiring a security clearance. Oswald was still assigned to MACS 9 and working in operations as a radar operator when I was transferred out of the squadron in May of 1959 for processing and staging an overseas tour of duty. In June of 1959, I sailed to Japan aboard the USS Breckenridge with several hundred other Marines, including Kerry Thornley. We had about 4 weeks at sea, with plenty of spare time for bull sessions, chess matches, card games, and reading. Kerry was busy with his notes about the events or non-events of the day. He wrote on 3x5 cards. He was incessant in this activity. He said he wanted to be a writer since about the age of 14. His daily notes would provide grist for some yet unidentified novel. He was... Oh, God damn it. Hold on a second. All right, Kerry. If you needed to come to become Oswald, mentally and sometimes physically, and you needed to get into Oswald's head, and you needed to come to understand every step that Oswald had been through in his time in the Marines, and you needed to take notes on that for future operations, what would be the greatest cover in the world? That you were taking notes for a future book. There we go. He was truly a writer looking for something about which to write. Shortly after arriving in Japan, he began his first draft of a novel about life in the peacetime Marines entitled The Idle Warriors. Another activity of his was a study of the Japanese written language, or at least one variation of it. In this, he also used 3x5 cards as flashcards to reinforce his memorization of basic pictographs. As I became better acquainted with him, I found him to be an interesting person and a stimulating conversationalist. Kerry Thornley never saw Lee Oswald after he left MACS 9 in 1959. Bullshit. Of this I am convinced, Garrison's allegations notwithstanding. We discussed Oswald after we read of his defection to the Soviet Union a few months later. I am not sure if it was at this time or on board a ship going to Japan when Kerry told me of his last conversation with Oswald. Kerry said that it was at a retirement parade at El Toro Marine Base. We had been standing around for information before the parade. Oswald reportedly had complained about being required to participate. Kerry said something like, "Well, come the revolution, we'll change all that, comrade?" He meant this as a joke, but Oswald reacted angrily and said, "Not you too, Thornley," and walked off with hard heels. They never spoke again to each other. A few days later, Thornley and I, along with a few hundred others, departed for Japan aboard the USS Breckinridge. Okay, so that incident with Oswald has been told by everybody. Delgado and Simcoe and Thornley and who the fuck else. And it is so goddamn close to the same story without variation. Then that's a planted story, clearly. Kerry mentioned someone in MACS 9 had said Oswald had been reduced in rank to private while stationed in Japan. When drunk, he poured beer over a sergeant's head. See, that didn't happen. That was just a verbal altercation. But you see how this game of telephone works. We thought this was atypical of Oswald's behavior, and at least we observed him in California. Kerry had also heard that Oswald's security clearance had been revoked because of this incident. I was skeptical because Oswald was still standing radar watches in California, and it seemed unlikely that a security clearance would be withdrawn, and then the same person would be allowed to continue working in a classified area. What would be the point of revoking a security clearance, particularly for sophomoric social conduct? So let me pause real quick. So if I'm remembering correctly, there's one of the guys. I don't remember which one it was. I'll have to dig it up. I don't remember if it was William Augg, Augg, or who was it? I don't recall offhand. But one of the guys was stationed at the main base at El Toro, not the MACF station at Santa Ana. And he said that he was stationed there with Oswald and that Oswald was assigned mess duty the whole fucking time, right? So that's Lee Oswald at El Toro. But there was another statement that I read. God, who was it? It's in my notes somewhere. I'm going to have to dig it up soon for my fucking book that I'm going to start here like any fucking day now. See, I'm just battling over what do I start next? Do I start the document book, which I'm working on? Do I start the documentary? Do I finish my slide presentation and sell that with the book? What do I do next? Do I start the next book? I got 4 or 5 things on my agenda, and I'm kind of having a hard time picking what to do next. So, because they're already underway. All of them are started already. So, I'm having a little OCD moments trying to move forward. But there's another one that says that Oswald, when they got to MACS 9, Oswald was doing fucking he was like dumping trash cans and like doing janitor work and stuff like that because of his security clearance having been pulled, right? So we get some contradictory information here at MACS 9. So maybe he wasn't ever stationed as a radar nook, and perhaps he was just the janitor and stuff, and people just weren't clear on it. So that's a possibility. In 1978, I had 2 lengthy telephone conversations with Jim Botello. That's the guy who was in the Marines with Oswald also. In San Juan Bautista, California. Botello was also a 6741 radar operator who spent a couple of years in MACS 9 in 58 and 59. I knew him at that time, but in 1978 was the first time we had spoken since 1959. Botello was nearing the end of a 3-year enlistment at MACS 9 when I departed for duty in Japan. Oswald had been sharing one of the rooms at one end of a hut with a private Nelson Delgado. Botello said it had developed that Oswald and Delgado were not getting along. A rearrangement of personnel quarters resulted. Thereafter, Botello shared a room with Oswald, while Delgado took Botello's former space in another hut. This arrangement continued until Oswald was suddenly, on short notice, discharged from the Marines. Botello, who later was appointed a judge in his hometown of San Juan Bautista, California, said his statement to the Warren Commission did not reflect what he really said. In fact, the editing of his statement had changed the meaning of his statement. Botello said he did not believe Oswald was pro-Russian at all. While acknowledging Oswald's interest in the Russian language and doctrines, Botello said Oswald, quote, hated bureaucracy in the Soviet Union as much as he did in the United States. Oswald may have been more candid with Botello than others, but I don't know for sure. In view of other sources of information, I am convinced that Oswald had at that time already been recruited for intelligence work. Since he was a Marine, a branch of the Department of the Navy, this logically would have been with ONI, the Office of Naval Intelligence. With this in mind, I doubt he was being totally candid with anyone while he was in MACS 9. Botello said that after my departure from MACS 9 for duty in Japan, Oswald was assigned to replace me as the squadron S&C file clerk. This surprised me, because to function in this capacity, a secret security clearance was required. Oswald would have been cleared only for confidential, the standard clearance for a radar operator. Also, I have been under the impression that his spelling wasn't too good. I believe that he had some kind of dyslexic impediment when writing, and the drafting in administrative documents was one of requirements for the position. Typing skills were essential, skills that Oswald did not possess. As I confirmed decades later while reading a biography about Oswald written by Norman Mailer, Oswald's Tale, Random House, 1995. Half of the 50-odd pages of Oswald's notes related to his observations of industrial procedures in the USSR and other technical matters are published beginning on page 3 of the appendix in this book. Anyone who takes the time to read these notes would be hard-pressed to conclude that these are ramblings of an unintelligent person or deranged malcontent. Upon returning to the USA from the USSR, Oswald hired a woman to transcribe a portion of extensive handwritten notes he had made regarding activities in the USSR, reprinted in Mailer's book. God damn it, now that's another book I gotta fucking buy. I just bought 6 books yesterday. As noted in the above citation, an interesting read. It bellies the notion that in some quarters that Oswald was not too bright, but he did not know how to type and would have been an unlikely candidate to replace the departing S&C clerk, yours truly, unless there were other reasons. This is all weird and fucking compelling, isn't it? Botello said that the new Sergeant Major Brown disliked Oswald and his salty attitude, scruffy appearance, and scuffed boots. Oswald was placed on report by the Sergeant Major more than once, but Oswald was never concerned and always seemed to avoid disciplinary action. Since Sergeant Major Brown didn't like Oswald, he didn't want him working in the administration unit. When I learned of this assignment from Botello years later, it seemed to have been a peculiar arrangement, i.e. his lack of job-specific qualifications and personality conflict with the Sergeant Major, his direct superior. In retrospect, however, this assignment now seems logical if Oswald indeed had been recruited by ONI and was soon to be leaving the squadron, the Marines, and the United States for his phony defection to the Soviet Union. Botello said he believes a Lieutenant Donovan, who was also assigned to administration, interceded between Oswald and the Sergeant Major and was probably Oswald's intelligence control officer in MACS 9. Donovan being Oswald's intelligence control officer. Interesting. Because Donovan, I think, knew him overseas briefly, too. But that would imply he knew, well, Jesus. I'm sorry. I'm going to close that tangent and put it back in my pocket for now. Lieutenant Donovan contacted Kerry Thornley several years later to suggest a reunion, but nothing resulted along these lines. Botello said that in August or September of 1959, most personnel in the squadron went on maneuvers at Camp Pendleton, California, while a few men, including Oswald, stayed behind as a skeleton crew at the main base. When maneuvers were completed, Botello returned and discovered Oswald was no longer at MACS 9. he had been transferred abruptly to the main base at El Toro and was in the separations unit awaiting a hardship discharge. You know, the funny thing about the hardship discharge is that when you're going through, God, I don't think it's either the Don Abedian file or the Folsom exhibit. I think it's probably the Folsom exhibit. There's a page when you get to Oswald's discharge stuff, and it's got a big diagonal stamp, and it says discharged due to end of enlistment period. Which, honestly, and this is the funny thing about Oswald's discharge when he was discharged, almost like the whole thing was planned years in advance. He's supposed to he's supposed to get out in December of 1959, right? So that's when he's on paper as having supposed to at that time normally discharged from the Marines, December of 1959. But he joined in October of 59. But he joined in October of 1956, right? So why is that significant? Why did he join in October but was supposed to be discharged in December? Why is that? Well, because he went to the brig for 45 days in Japan. And they added 45 days onto his obligation of service. That's what pushed it back to December. So, if it wasn't for the 45 days in the brig, it wouldn't have been pushed back, and his date would have been cut. Would have been like the first week of it would have been October the 24th. But I think he had some time gained. Like there was some notations of days of assigned leave that were canceled or something along those lines. But ultimately, that's when he was supposed to get out, early October. So why would they make such a big deal of him and do this fake dropping out and going to, Albert Schweitzer and all that stuff? Why would they do that? Did everything have to be kept on that schedule? I mean, did they set things up 3 years in advance and he was supposed to get out in October and then do everything in October? But then he got in trouble and then ended up in the brig and they had to add time on, which meant they had to cut that time back off some way in one shape or form or another. They had to cut off the 45 days that he was delayed in the fucking brig. That's basically all he did. He goes to the brig, it's extended 45 days, and then they had to cut that off and come up with a big story about cutting that off. The weird thing is that the application to the Albert Schweitzer College was back in March, right? So they're not stupid. All the paperwork was sent to him at the goddamn Marine base. They go through your mail. They're not stupid. They know what the fuck time it is. And he applied to Albert Schweitzer College in March, saying that he was going to be there in April of 60. I don't know. The whole thing just reeks of shenanigans, as Cube would say. All right. This was a surprise to Botello because as Oswald's last roommate at MACS 9, he never heard him speak of any hardship situation at home, nor was Botello aware of any problems involving Oswald's mother. Her circumstances were ostensibly responsible for his hardship discharge. Oswald only had a few weeks remaining on his regular enlistment of 3 years, and then it appeared to be an unusual situation. See, here we go. Oswald only had a few weeks remaining on his regular enlistment of 3 years. And then it appeared to be an unusual situation, right? So it seems a lot of times Oswald tried to get out of the Marines and get out of all this shit by shooting himself and then going to the brig, and they kept working with him, right? They just kept keeping him in, and all they did was demote him in rank. It's like he was trying to get himself kicked out, and they wouldn't let him. They're like, "No, motherfucker, you're in this for life." While awaiting his hardship discharge, Oswald returned to MACS 9 to visit with Botello. He repeatedly spoke to Botello and others about possibly going to Cuba and referenced being paid to train troops. Let's see, this is 59. That's not unusual because Jerry Hemming and those fucking guys ended up doing that, right? So, and Lauren Hall and those guys. So it's not unusual for him to say that, right? Because in 59, so you got to think, this is September of 59. When did Castro become a communist? December of 61, right? December 61. So when he's talking about going, this is so stupid. This is so stupid because nobody was a communist in fucking Cuba in 59. Nobody. There was no communism going on in Cuba till December of 61. Remember, because this connects back to the Fair Play for Cuba Committee and why they would fucking incorporate in April of 1960 when they are not communists, right? These fucking people are so stupid. I swear to God, this is what you do when you have high-level operations being executed by low IQ individuals. All right, let me start this paragraph over and catch my composure here. While awaiting his hardship discharge, Oswald returned to MACS 9 to visit with Botelho. He repeatedly spoke to Botelho and others about possibly going to Cuba and referenced being paid to train troops. Again, not unusual. Botelho said a Sergeant Charlie Call was present on one such occasion, as were others. Oswald seemed to be trying to recruit them to volunteer. That's not a big deal, like I just said. Botelho recalls that he told Oswald that he, Botelho, was a lover, not a fighter. And besides, he knew nothing about training troops. Oswald reportedly said they could fake it. He made this suggestion more than once with apparent seriousness, but no one expressed interest. Botelho reported this to the Warren Commission, which did not appear in the final report. Botelho said everyone was surprised when Oswald's discharge was granted so quickly. It wasn't long before the remaining personnel at MACS 9 learned of his defection to the Soviet Union. Several speculated that he was on a mission for the government and not a genuine defector. Botelho said that after Oswald's defection, a couple of men in civilian clothes came to the squadron and asked a few questions, but this was low-keyed. The Warren Commission quoted Private Nelson Delgado, Oswald's former hutmate at MACS 9, prior to Botelho, as saying there was a big investigation. Botelho said Delgado wasn't even there at the time, having been previously discharged. In later years, I read that Delgado, when speaking of Kerry Thornley, said Thornley didn't even live in the same area. This I know to be false. Thornley's hometown was a few miles away in Whittier, California, but at the time he did not drive and lived in a Quonset hut at MACS 9, although he had been part of the squadron for only a few weeks prior to being assigned for duty in Japan. Thornley's association with Oswald was primarily by day during standby situations in the ready room, or while on radar watch. To my knowledge, he never socialized with Oswald after hours. The issue of where Thornley lived was hardly a relevant observation, in my opinion. Botelho said he advised the investigators making inquiries following Oswald's reported defection that he believed Oswald was on an intelligence mission of some sort, and that his defection was not genuine. Botelho said he is of the definite opinion that Oswald never shot anyone. He has first-hand knowledge of his own testimony being edited when published in the Warren Commission report. In addition, he's too aware of the Altgens UPI photograph, which was taken at the time President Kennedy was reacting to the first shot. This photograph reveals someone looking like Oswald peeking around the front entrance of the Texas Schoolbook Depository. Botelho said this figure closely resembles Oswald, as he remembers, and the figure in the photo is wearing the same type of shirt as Oswald when he was arrested in Dallas. Insert note, March 2014. Over the years, I've found it curious that many written accounts of Oswald's reported activities included emphasis by authorities that he changed shirts after leaving work, going to his rooming house, and then a movie theater. There's a photo of him in a shirt as described above after being taken into custody, which matches up with the UPI photo taken as noted above. However, no description is reported by the officer who first encountered him in the lunchroom or any other follow-up information. Could it be because it would be inconvenient to have a photo of the alleged assassin watching from near the front door just as the gunshots were fired, with enough time to slip into the lunchroom just minutes before the police arrived? An issue regarding the changing of a shirt by Oswald would tend to skew inquiries associated with the UPI photo of Oswald wearing the same shirt as when arrested, with the same hair and face features of the figure in the UPI photo. See the comments, Billy Lovelady, co-worker of Oswald, later in this narrative. Lovelady was identified by the Warren Commission as being the figure in the Altgens UPI photo, despite the published photo of him near the front door in other publications. Lovelady was wearing a different pattern shirt as compared to Oswald's and had a full beard. Clearly, this was not Lovelady in the UPI photo. Okay, so thank you very much to Diana Thomas, who pulled all these photos and analyzed these and determined that what Buddy Allen Simcoe here is talking about is not Billy Lovelady. It's a black guy. So let me continue on. Back to the original narrative. I phoned Jim Botello in 1979 after being contacted by Dave Bucknell via Kerry Thornley. Bucknell said that he had transferred to MACS-9 a short time prior to my departure for Japan. I had a vague recollection of him, but he is not someone I personally became acquainted with at the time. He was not a radar operator, nor did he work in the administration section, as I did. He had been assigned to the radio section. Botello said he did not have a clear recollection of Bucknell from MACS-9, which surprised me since Botello remained at MACS-9 until eventually completing his period of enlistment. However, when Botello later became acquainted with Bucknell in about 1978, a year before I contacted Botello by phone, he'd become involved in a business venture with Bucknell. This commercial association was short-lived and not successful. Botello must have then had confidence in Bucknell and what he had to say because he never did enter into a business arrangement with him, and during that time he and Bucknell often discussed Oswald's activities at MACS-9 and subsequent events. Bucknell said that he had been acquainted with Oswald during the summer of 1959 while at MACS-9, and in fact they had a small money lending operation going. Small change, such as 5 for $7 or 10 for $12 until payday, a common practice. This was the first day I ever heard of Oswald being involved with money lending. However, I knew nothing of his activities after working hours. I suppose if anyone had cash, it would have been Oswald. He certainly appeared to be fiscally conservative. Bucknell said he believed Oswald was involved in the intelligence community when both arrived at MACS-9 in the spring of 1959. Sorry, guys, I'm laughing because my freaking dog is drinking like a gallon of water, like right behind me of all times. There was an occasion when he and Oswald were both ordered to report to Criminal Investigation Division at the main base. Bucknell was worried that this was related to their money lending operation. Oswald reportedly, God, I get to the good part, and when a neighbor starts shoveling snow, my dog's drinking water. Hazel, cut it out. He and Oswald were both ordered to report to the Criminal Investigation Division at the main base. Bucknell was worried that this was related to their money lending operation. Oswald reportedly was not worried and reminded Bucknell that Kerry Thornley had also been ordered to report, and Thornley was not involved with money lending activities. They attended a lecture with several Marines, including Kerry Thornley. The topic was foreign affairs and contemporary events. A question was asked, would anyone consider involvement in clandestine operations and subterfuge as a legitimate means to an end if for the greater good? Bucknell said the meeting was followed by individual sessions, but he doesn't know what Thornley did thereafter. Later, I asked Thornley about what Bucknell had reported. He didn't remember attending such a meeting, but he believed that at the time he would have been receptive to such an overture. Bucknell was positive in his recollection, while Thornley had no clear recall of the meeting, although generally he had an excellent memory. He did say that there were several orientation sessions associated with his arrival at El Toro Marine Base in the first place, and later other sessions related to his rotation to Japan with the overseas draft. I attended general assemblies associated with the overseas draft, but not the sessions Bucknell described. Also, as a matter of routine, in prior months, we attended periodic lectures conducted by visiting officers from headquarters at MACS-9 prior to the arrival of Kerry Thornley or Oswald. Bucknell said he returned to CID for follow-up sessions, as did Oswald. Bucknell was screened further, and at one time, he was asked if he would consider going to South America for purposes of teaching radio and electronic skills in the military operation somewhere in the jungle. Although nothing specific was discussed, he told me that he expressed interest in response to the question but said he was never contacted again. Bucknell said that Oswald confided that he might be defecting to the Soviet Union on a mission, or at least that he had been asked if he would consider it. Otherwise, no details were mentioned. Bucknell said that after Oswald's arrest and murder 4 years later, he knew that Oswald had been set up. He said he became so paranoid as a result that he lived under an assumed name for the next 9 years. I spoke with Bucknell by phone 3 or 4 times in 1979 and once in person, and have had no contact with him since 79. When I first met Dave Bucknell in mid-'79, a man named Ivan Septoff, Septoff, was present, as were Greg Hill and Kerry Thornley. There was also another man from Atlanta, but I don't remember his name. When Kerry introduced him, he humorously said that he had suspected one or both of us was CIA. I just laughed it off, having been aware of his intermittent paranoid tendencies for years. Kerry's suspicions may have been sparked in part by my higher security clearance as a Marine, as a secret and confidential file clerk, and perhaps my later 5-year period of civilian employment as an insurance investigator for a large nationwide corporation based out of Atlanta, Georgia, at the time known as the Retail Credit Company, now known as Equifax. Kerry seemed to, just to point something out here real quickly, just to remember all the shenanigans with Marguerite Oswald's credit report pulled from the Retail Credit Company. And we wonder if the CIA has people planted at these credit institutions to alter records. Buddy Simcoe just admitted to it. Tripping down memory lane, continuing on, Kerry seemed to think that he, as an active duty Marine from 58 to 60, bullshit, he was on active from 56 to 60, and I can prove it, was the subject of monitoring by CIA types. I thought that this notion was absurd. As a kid fresh out of high school with a year or two of college and no association with nefarious people or activities, I cannot imagine any reason for his concern. After Kerry returned to Los Angeles from New Orleans in '64, I attended his wedding and a few of his parties. I considered him to be an interesting fellow and, for a while, a friend. His suspicions about me and many others manifested after his indictment by Jim Garrison some time after his move from L.A. to Tampa, circa 66 to 67. Remember, in L.A., he worked in the same building that Johnny Roselli lived in, and they had many conversations in Johnny Roselli's apartment, in case no one's ever been aware of that. Kerry telephoned me in 67 or 68 from Florida. I was living in Long Beach, California at the time. He said that he expected I would be contacted by someone from Jim Garrison's office in New Orleans for verification of some information that he provided to them, specifically that he was writing a book partially based on Oswald years prior to 1963. Garrison didn't believe him. Kerry only asked me to speak the truth, which of course I promised to do. He also said for the first time that he suspected a lot of people, including me, of being informants. Although this was part of a friendly phone conversation, I was surprised and perplexed. Informants regarding what? There was nothing about which to inform. I now know, however, that stress was likely taking its toll and causing his emotional and mental condition to deteriorate. No one ever contacted me from Garrison's office or anyone else for verification of information of any kind about Kerry Thornley, with the exception of a visit from an FBI agent on November 24th, 1963, the day following President Kennedy's assassination, as detailed later on in this paper. At that time, I provide a one-page statement stating that I had served in the same squadron as Oswald while on active duty in the Marines, and that Kerry Thornley had known Oswald during that time in the Marines, and that later had begun a novel based in part on Oswald, after he learned that Oswald had defected to the Soviet Union. Otherwise, no one has ever inquired, officially or otherwise, about Kerry Thornley. Thereafter, Kerry was suspicious of just about everyone except Greg Hill, a friend since high school, and a couple of others. From then on, his mental condition was sometimes fragile, until he died of natural causes in 1999 in Atlanta, Georgia. At the time of the 1979 meeting, Bucknell said Ivan Septoff was researching material for a magazine article about the JFK assassination. During a follow-up phone conversation with Greg Hill some weeks later, Bucknell said that Ivan Septoff was an FBI informant. I recall Septoff asking me when we first met what I thought of the FBI. I replied that I thought they were a thoroughly discredited organization. This was a strong opinion made in reference to a few of the FBI's reported activities or non-activities associated with political assassinations and other events, such as the framing of Geronimo Pratt, a black activist, and the harassment of Martin Luther King Jr. Also, I want to evaluate Septoff's response. I acknowledge that there are many outstanding individuals in the FBI. I was making reference to the agenda as had been established by the FBI's corrupted leadership for so many years. Mafia? What mafia? Septoff told me that he had learned from a friend of his that the FBI had changed. I replied that I didn't know about any changes, but thought the die has been cast. We dropped the subject, although no doubt my remarks likely got my name placed on a few watch lists, resulting in later special attention in various forms years prior to 9/11. Septoff wrote down his address in the event I wanted to communicate. I had no reason to do so. A post office box number in Berkeley. He called me a month later with some additional information about Bucknell's military discharge, citing a specific paragraph number. That was our second and final contact. As a follow-up to the information given to me by Septoff, I wrote to the Navy Department for confirmation. I referenced Bucknell's full name, service number, dates of service, and the specific paragraph describing the type of discharge. I received a written reply stating I would have to provide a signed authorization from the person in question. I wrote back and said to disregard personal information and service dates, amending my request for verification of the type of discharge as previously originally referenced as provided by Ivan Septoff. I received no reply. I never had occasion to speak with Bucknell and Botello together, only separately. Botello by phone. It had been some time, this was in 1979, since there had been any direct communication between them because of hard feelings due to $5,000 loss resulting from their short-lived business venture dealing in agricultural products. Bucknell contacted Botello several months earlier. It was at this time that they really became acquainted, not years earlier at MACS 9 when they were both still on active duty at MACS 9. Bucknell said he wanted to ask about Oswald, to learn what he thought of the Warren Commission report and the official line regarding Oswald. All right, so here that ends a section and it becomes another section. Turning to other matters, and then he starts to talk about a book by Robert Morrow called Betrayal, which is still sitting right in front of me. I'm looking right at it. I need to read it, but I'm halfway through like 4 other books. So, but I'm going to call it here for today, guys, and that is an excellent overview of Buddy Simcoe and his potential role as Kerry Thornley's intelligence handler. Okay, so here, this was written obviously after Kerry Thornley's confession letter to Jim Garrison, right? And so what is this, really? I don't know what this is. Is this a handler's attempt to write his way out of the story? Because, remember, Kerry Thornley's 50-page affidavit was a confession. And it's in this confession where he tells the truth, mixed with a whole bunch of shenanigans, to cover his true involvement. But still, he does his best at telling the truth. And while he's doing his best to tell the truth, he says, if anyone was my intelligence handler, it was this guy. And these guys stayed in touch for years after they got out of the Marines. So... And they met up a couple times, not only in New Orleans, but also in California, right? So what the fuck are you supposed to think? Of course, this guy seems like he's a handler. But I need to do some research into Botello. I think a lot of guys in the Marines with Oswald were there to handle him. Probably recruited CIA. CIA then sends them to the Marines. Hey, while you're in the Marines, this is a good practice run, right? Keep an eye on this guy. Report back what you see, I think that was the case with the 6 guys who were at Biloxi with him. Powers and Schrand, who gets killed, probably because he wanted out of the operation. And they were like, there is no out. And who else? Brereton. And the other guys. We've talked about them before. But I'm going to call it here for today, guys, and we're not going to come back to Buddy Simcoe for a while. If you're interested in this, you can Google Tripping Down Memory Lane by Buddy Simcoe, and you can find the remainder of this book. But that's going to do it for me. I'll be back with more of Lillian Moret's testimony tomorrow. Thanks, guys.